Good morning. This morning we're going to talk a little bit about the Millennial Goals and what we just had discussion in the class. Let's go through the Millennial Goals. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Eradicate extreme poverty and hunger was the number one, and then there's 4 or 5 of them I think that you could discuss. I don't know how important they are when we get through talking about everything. I don't know how important those are, but achieve primary education, gender equality, and empowerment of women, reduce child mortality, maternal health, combat HIV, malaria, and other diseases, environmental sustainability, and then global partnership for development. And I thought those are really interesting if you take a look at them in total. And I think that's one thing that I really want you to think about is how do all those goals fit together based on what we're talking about? Why are we talking about the Millennial Goals when we're talking about this biosystems energy class? So think about how all those goals fit together. What's the underlying premises there? And also, when you think about that, in terms of what we're going to be talking about throughout the course is, think about the world's ability to feed, clothe, and house, and provide medical care to all the recipients, all the people in the world. And that's really where we're at with these Millennial Goals, is trying to achieve that. And I think what's really the most interesting point here that's going to tie into the ecosystems is that we're doing all of that with one major input, and that's with cheap oil. And so that's what's driving cheap food, cheap clothing, cheap housing, and medical care. And so all those things, when you read through those Millennial Goals again now, I want you to keep that in mind, that what we're talking about is being able to accomplish these things, but we're doing that with this constant input, this constant inflow into the system of cheap energy, and that may not be the case. And so the second thing would be for you to think about, okay, if we're trying to meet these goals and we're doing this based on the fact that we have this cheap energy, then what happens when we don't have that cheap energy? What happens to these goals that we have, or what happens to the items we've just listed in there? What happens to each one of those? So the next thing we want to talk about, which is the topic for this week, is ecosystems and ecosystem services. And to get the ball rolling, let's just think about for a minute about what it is to be an ecosystem and what are the components that give you that definition. And an ecosystem really has two components to it. It has the living organisms that are inhabiting that ecosystem, and then we call all those living organisms, we call that the community. And then we have the physical and chemical factors, structures, etc., that comprise that ecosystem. And there's two main things that happen in that ecosystem. That all of those things, all of those living organisms and those factors are linked by a nutrient cycle and an energy cycle. And this ties right back to what we just got through talking about, was that you have that ecosystem, and in that ecosystem that we're trying to get those development goals to get us to a higher level in that ecosystem. In order to get there, right, we're having to have that constant input of cheap oil, of cheap energy, and cheap nutrients that we haven't talked about yet. So you realize that most of the food and the clothing that's produced and the housing and the medical care comes from either the input of cheap nutrients into the system or cheap fuel into the system. Those are things that are outside that are being brought into the ecosystem. So they're constantly brought in, instead of having a system where those nutrients or that energy flows within the system and it's recaptured and retooled. So when you think about that ecosystem, and you're going to be asked to identify a specific ecosystem, it could be a small community like Stillwater. It could be a small pond, a rainforest. There are lots of unique ecosystems. There's a larger ecosystem that would be the planet, a larger one would be the solar system, etc. So think about that ecosystem and think about how that works, and try to tie that back to the idea of these millennial goals in terms of each one of those millennial goals is doing something to that ecosystem as it currently works. Why are the things that are going on in the world today happening based on the ability of that ecosystem to provide ecosystem services? And how do we think that we're going to be able to change that, and more importantly, change it and make it sustainable? So again, I want you to go back and kind of rehash those Millennium Goals in your own mind. You might want to post some of your thoughts on the discussion. I think it's always fun to see what everybody has to say. But think about those Millennial Goals in terms of, again, sort of the overarching theme of how all those Millennial Goals fit together. What is the driving force behind there? And I think you'll see what I'm talking about, especially as you move into the next chapter and talk about ecosystems. Okay, so we'll see you again next week.